my pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Christopher Millard, Professor of Privacy and Information Law and the head of the Cloud Legal Project at Queen Mary University Center for Commercial Law Study. He's also a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute and a senior counsel at the law firm Bristol. He's also the joint director of the Cloud Computing Research Center, which is a collaboration between Queen Mary University London and the University of Cambridge Computer Laboratory. And he has over 30 years of experience in technology law in both academia and in practice, and we have worked together at the Microsoft Cloud Computing Research Center, obviously. And he is one of the rare speakers that make law interesting to me. So, and I believe it's a great skill.
Thank you, Thomas, for that very kind welcome. And I have to say, you're one of the rare computer scientists who makes computer science interesting to me. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for setting this up. Now, as Thomas mentioned, I've been working in this field for quite some time. In fact, this is the 35th anniversary this year of my journey as a technology lawyer. And throughout that time, privacy and data protection, as it's called in most countries outside the US, have featured significantly. But I have to say, in the early 1980s, those were not exactly well, careful what I say as a camera. They're not exactly sexy topics, let's put it that way. So I'm quite pleased that thanks to the internet and various developments in terms of surveillance scandals and other things which many of you will be familiar with, privacy and data protection are finally hot topics. And what I want to talk about today is not a great deal of law, actually. You'll be relieved to hear. I will talk about the law a little bit, can't quite avoid that. Although I will dabble very tentatively in areas of technology, I'm delighted to know there are a lot of experts in the room who can take over as soon as I get out of my depth. And in particular, on this topic of localization of online services and cloud computing services in particular, if you have any technical questions about internet flow control and tagging data in networks and so on, then Thomas, who you just heard from, is your man. So I'll be bouncing those kind of questions back to him. I had the pleasure of working with Thomas on those kind of topics a few years ago in the UK. So just to set the scene, however, some of you may have heard this recurring debate, which has been running now for decades, about whether the internet has rendered law obsolete. And my favorite quote from an advocate for this position is this one. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They are based on matter, and there is no matter here. Who could tell me who wrote that? Thank you. And what was the context? Very, very good. Let me guess. Are you from the Berkman Center? Okay. I only ask because he has an affiliation with the Berkman Center. It was indeed John Perry Barlow, his Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace. And he did that on behalf of the Electronic Frontier Foundation at the time. He was cattle rancher and lyricist for the Grateful Dead band, although I'm not sure whether they disbanded by then. As you can see, he thought the game was over, basically. Internet, that's the end of law and governments and jurisdiction and sovereignty. Okay, that was February 1996. Now, I always kick myself for not having sent him a year earlier an article I'd written on cyberspace and the no regulation fallacy. So this is a very short excerpt from that. My view, having looked at how internet technologies worked and were deployed, and having looked at law and regulation, I came to the opposite conclusion to John Perry Barlow, and I thought there were numerous laws, statutes, regulations that apply to everything you can do in online networks. Now, that doesn't mean they're always going to make sense. It doesn't mean they're going to be enforced. But they are there, and they do apply, and they, in my view, still apply. So wrote a couple of articles on that in 95 and 96. I have to say that history suggests that reports of the death of sovereignty were, in fact, rather exaggerated. So Barlow's declaration was wildly popular when it came out, and it got reposted on thousands of websites. And bear in mind, there weren't very many websites, relatively speaking, back in 1996. And many of them carried a link to Barlow's Declaration of Independence for Cyberspace. Unfortunately, that was not borne out to be realistic in the fullness of time. And when he was asked 8 years later to comment on his earlier cyber libertarian optimism, he simply said, "We all get older and smarter." And in fact, we had case law, particularly in Europe, establishing very clearly that many laws, including criminal laws and many civil laws, and private arrangements between, say, contracting parties, still apply. They are still enforceable in online environments. And these days, targeting and other ways of carving up the internet, which is really the focus of our topic today, based on many things, including geolocation technologies, are widespread. They're common. So filtering, censorship, service localization, local taxation of online services. Again, very messy, lots of conflicts of law, lots of overlapping jurisdictions. But these things are now widely acknowledged to be there, and they have not been abolished just thanks to the Declaration of Independence for cyberspace. And there's a good book on this if you want to read more, which is, I would say, Goldsmith and Wu's book, Who Controls the Internet? Illusions of a Borderless World. So let's turn briefly to cloud computing and why regulation of cloud is in the news a lot at the moment. And this is a very brief summary. There's a whole semester online program on this if you're interested to hear more, but this is the sort of 1.5-minute version. So basically, the explosive growth in online services, frequently these days mediated by or supported via various cloud services, it's highly disruptive. It's disruptive to people's business models. It's disruptive technically for traditional IT actors. It's certainly disruptive commercially, and in terms of legal and regulatory terms, it's producing, well, let's just say, a lot of work for lawyers and regulators. Now, many of the concerns relate to compliance with legal obligations or regulatory obligations, and who should be liable if things go wrong or if somebody suffers harm of any kind. Excuse me, getting over a New England cold. Right. And of course, the revelations of massive and systematic government surveillance, thanks to Edward Snowden, haven't exactly boosted people's trust and faith in the cloud and other online services. And of course, the internet is a global network of networks. It's really rather different to anything we've seen, I would say, in the past before at least the 80s and 90s. But geography still matters. It still matters in terms of legal obligations. It still matters in terms of regulation and enforcement. Now, the fact that we have massive data pipes and hyperscale data centers actually provides many points on the planet, geographical points at which regulators can seek to intervene and in which people can bring legal claims in courts in various parts of the world. Now, you know probably far more about global networking than I do, but this particular one caught my eye recently. This is the Microsoft Facebook joint venture to build a 6,600-kilometer transatlantic cable from Virginia Beach to Bilbao in northern Spain. It's currently under construction. I understand it's going to be the biggest pipe of its kind to date, but it's by no means the first. So here you see just some of the biggest international, intercontinental, actually, in many cases, networks that exist on which this internet and cloud and online service ecosystem lives. And my point in saying this is that you may think that cloud is sort of the ultimate vaporware, you know, made of water, but it's not actually, because it's definitely grounded in physical kit, physical stuff. This is just a brief example of what you can see in terms of hyperscale data centers. This is the world's largest privately owned solar energy farm. And in the background, doesn't look very big, is a hyperscale data center owned by Apple. And they're building another one next door, apparently, in North Carolina. IBM and many others are frequently announcing huge additional multi-billion-dollar investments in terms of growing their global footprint for cloud services. This is Amazon Web Services, probably the largest enterprise cloud provider for governments and businesses at the moment, along with Microsoft, which is the other key player in that sector. They now offer 42 availability zones in 16 geographic regions. They've announced another 8 zones and 3 more regions. So rather than imagining this place, cyberspace, is out there somewhere above the planet, not regulated, not with a physical footprint, the opposite, I'm afraid, is true. At least I say afraid for the cyber libertarians who thought they'd got rid of terrestrial law. So it is a highly physical environment, and it is grounded in lots of different legal jurisdictions. But what's privacy got to do with it? Well, you may or may not be familiar with this, but 120 countries, that's about 2/3 of the countries on the planet, have general or omnibus data protection laws, and 30 more have bills. So pretty soon, almost everybody will have a data protection law. However, the United States is not one of them. So the United States is an outlier. The US has a very different approach to regulation of privacy. You have what we call a patchwork quilt of very specific privacy laws, which are usually triggered by whatever happens to have been in the news last week. So, for example, one of my favorites here is the so-called Bork Bill, where many years ago, a nominee for the Supreme Court was somewhat annoyed and embarrassed when his video rental records were divulged online. So there had to be a law against it, and there is a law against it. And there are numerous laws like that, which deal with extremely granular, narrow areas of privacy. The approach in most of the rest of the world is very different. We have general purpose omnibus data protection laws, which generally cover both government, so the public sector, and the private sector, such as businesses. And many of these data protection laws outside the US have very long arm reach. For example, the EU's new General Data Protection Regulation, which comes into force fully next year and replaces our existing data protection directive and national laws based on that, will apply to processing absolutely anywhere in the context of an EU establishment. Now, I put that in quotes. There's no time to go into that. It's a bit of law you probably don't want to hear about. It's different for tax. It's different for privacy. It's different for various purposes. But basically, if a business is established in any country in the European Union, then any activities it carries out in the context of that establishment will be regulated under this regulation to the extent that they involve the processing of personal data. Personal data is information about an identified or identifiable living individual. Another whole debate there about what happens with anonymization and pseudonymization and encryption. Maybe we'll get some of that in the questions later. But just want to show you the long arm reach. It's not even terrestrially limited. This could apply, never mind cyberspace, this could apply in outer space. So if you do something in the context of your establishment in the European Union, you are regulated everywhere. If the processing relates to that establishment. That's not enough, however. It's also long arm reach kind of on an inbound basis. So if you are outside the EU, let's say you are a US company and you only have, you're only incorporated in the United States, you have neither people nor subsidiaries nor equipment nor anything else in the EU, you will still be caught by this regulation if you are offering goods or services to individuals in the European Union or you're monitoring their behavior online. And that actually captures an awful lot of organizations that have no physical footprint or legal footprint even in the European Union. They will be caught by this. Now, data transfer restrictions have been around for decades in these data protection laws. They're a kind of anti-avoidance mechanism. So if you can imagine, just as there are rules about whether you can just shift your money offshore to a tax haven to stop paying tax, so there have been rules since the beginning, really, of data protection about whether you can just shift your data offshore so that you're no longer caught by the local regulation. That's a bit of that's a big simplification, but I hope you get the gist of what that's about. And in recent years, those data transfer or those data export controls have become a bit of a catalyst for localization of cloud and other online services. Bear in mind also that regulators and courts may increasingly, I think, enforce these rules on a global long-arm, long-reach basis, and some of them have or soon will have very significant powers to do so. In terms of an example of long-arm reach, you've probably heard of the famous or infamous case involving Google Spain and the so-called right to be forgotten. Again, no time to go into detail. Fascinating case. Love to debate that all day if anybody wants to. But the important point for this discussion is nothing to do with the right to be forgotten. It's the fact that the Court of Justice of the European Union, our highest appeal court in the EU, decided that even though it acknowledged that the Google search engine was entirely operated and controlled by Google Inc. in the United States, Nevertheless, because Google has a sales office in Spain through which it sells AdWords, which can appear then on search engine results pages, that was enough, as far as the court was concerned, to provide a link. Indeed, they said it was inextricably linked, and that meant that Spanish data protection law, and indeed the law of every other country in the European Union, applies to the operations of a Californian company if it happens to have a subsidiary doing something completely different, we could argue. They're not running the search engine at any rate, and those subsidiaries happen to be in countries in the EU. In terms of the draconian powers, they vary enormously at the moment in terms of enforcement powers and actual enforcement activity. However, under this new GDPR, as people are calling it, General Data Protection Regulation, the regulators and courts will have the power to fine organizations that are in breach up to 4% of their global revenues. Now, that is a big number. Some of the big cloud players, you know, they have global turnover, as we call it, global revenues in the 80, 90 billion range. 4% is non-trivial. It potentially will escalate this to a main board antitrust type issue where no longer can people say, oh yeah, privacy, all very well in theory. If we get into trouble, we'll pay some small compensation or small fines. This is going to be a very big deal from next year onwards. Now, privacy regulation, even before these new enforcement powers in Europe, had already become an international trade and international relations issue. And I want to give you just a few examples. There are many, but I'm just going to give you a sample. This one is an interview in February 2015 with your former president, Obama, who was asked whether US privacy regulation actually has any teeth compared to that in Europe, which is, quotes, very strong on these things. His response is very interesting. He said, sometimes the European response here is more commercially driven than anything else. There are some countries like Germany, given its history with the Stasi, that are very sensitive to these issues. But sometimes their vendors, you know, their service providers who can't compete with ours, are essentially trying to set up some roadblocks for our companies to operate effectively there. Now, actually, that's a very interesting statement. Again, we could unpack that for hours. I have some sympathy with what is said there. I think it's more complicated than that, and I would not be so dismissive of the privacy concerns as President Obama appeared to be. But there's no doubt this is a very complicated, multi-layered, multifaceted issue, and it isn't just about privacy. European concerns, by the way, are very long-standing. This quote I rather like because it has an American connection too. We do not really trust the data acts in other countries, or we feel that there are none at all. Code, United States. So we feel unprotected in those countries with our data, walking down Fifth Avenue in our underwear. That slightly racy way of looking at it dates back to the early 1970s. The statement was made by Kerstin Amer, an undersecretary in the Swedish government, as a justification for the world's first national data protection law, which was adopted in 1977. And that was a statute which included, like so many afterwards, a requirement that prior authorization be obtained for exports of personal data. Now, many of the more modern data protection statutes don't actually, at least in every case, require you to get an export license. You have other mechanisms, some of which I will touch on briefly, which can justify the transfers. But the point is, that's really where this localization debate started. It was, we might have a data protection law which we consider protects our citizens in, say, Sweden, but we are concerned that if data are processed, say, in the United States, they will lose that protection just because the data are in another place. Now, that's going back decades. These tensions definitely persist to this day, and some would say they're going to become a lot more important very soon. In terms of international trade, particularly given the uncertainty here about what the trade policy will be under the new administration. So not only does the US is not in this list of 120 countries with data protection laws or 30 more with bills, but it's not on a list of countries which is considered by the European Commission to have a, quote, adequate level of protection for transfers of personal data from the EU. This is extremely controversial and more than a little annoying for many people in the United States, some of whom have bent my ear on this point on many occasions. Now, there was a mechanism set up called the EU-US Safe Harbor, which was a fairly straightforward arrangement whereby companies, typically in the United States, could register under this safe harbor scheme, and provided they made a public commitment, which was enforceable under consumer protection or enforceable by the FTC, to comply with a set of principles which are broadly the same as those in the EU, then companies from anywhere in the EU could transfer data to these safe harbor rights, if I can call them that. Unfortunately, that particular arrangement was struck down by this Court of Justice of the European Union in an action brought by Max Schrems, an Austrian law student. Those of you law students, you can have an impact globally. And he challenged this in the light of the Snowden revelations and various other arguments, and he prevailed right up to the top appeal court. Now, the Irish High Court, and why is it Ireland? Well, it just so happens that in Ireland, the world's largest, which happens to mainly be US cloud service providers, tend to have their local footprint in terms of hyperscale data centers of the type I was showing you pictures of earlier. So the European footprint, the biggest concentration you'll find just outside Dublin. The Irish High Court's currently considering a challenge against Facebook's use of some standard contract clauses. This is another mechanism that was put in place so that it was possible to transfer data from the EU to companies in, say, the United States, which is not on the list of approved countries for data exports. That too, well, we don't know. Arguments have been held, extensive arguments have heard actually, and we expect a judgment sometime in the next few months on that. Meanwhile, the EU-US Privacy Shield, which is don't tell anybody, broadly similar to the safe harbor that was struck down, but it does have some extra features. For a start, it's a very, very long string of documents, but it does have some extra protections for EU citizens. It's proving very popular with companies, many of whom are rushing to register under this because they really need a simple mechanism that allows them to transfer data from anywhere in the European Union to their operations in the United States. That too may, in due course, however, be challenged using the same arguments as we used to strike down the safe harbor and are currently being used in Ireland to challenge the standard contract clauses. The first annual review, indeed, of the Privacy Shield is due in September this year. And as I sort of alluded a minute ago, it may be controversial given recent and current developments in the United States. But it's not just Europeans who worry about US hegemony, if I can call it that, in cross-border data services. Your much closer neighbors just north of here also have been uncomfortable for a very long time. So this is a quote from a Canadian federal government report in 1972, ancient history. As a sovereign state, Canada feels some national embarrassment and resentment over increasing quantities of often sensitive data about Canadians being stored in a foreign country. And recent bit of digging I did suggests that there are at least 2 provinces in Canada that still have effectively localization rules which stem from that early concern. So in British Columbia and Nova Scotia, public bodies are required by law to only store and access information they control in Canada. There are some limited exceptions, including, for example, consent, which is very hard to get in practice. But there you see that those early fears from 45 years ago, or whenever it was, did lead to actual localization legislation not far from here. And indeed, this, although this is actually misleading in my opinion, because it's suggesting for private organizations, they should fear, this is a little picture, you'll notice the Dropbox logo there. You shouldn't trust your Canadian data with a company in the United States. Those laws I mentioned are very specific. They're in 2 provinces and they relate to public sector processing. But this gives great ammunition to private companies trying to sell Canadian cloud services. And there are many other, I found a number of other sites actually with explicit fear tactics, I would call them, in their marketing. This is my favorite marketing hype on data localization, however. I'm sorry it's a long quote, but honestly, it's fun. So Jotta Cloud, you've probably never heard of them, is a Norwegian company with Norwegian owners, and we operate under Norwegian privacy laws. Are you getting a theme there? Okay. We store all your files in Norway. As a result, our users are protected against US legislation, which arguably infringes the freedom and liberties of both US and non-US citizens. We care about privacy. They're going to get poetic now. In Norway, privacy stands firm like the mighty mountains of Jotunheimen. In the US, on the other hand, privacy rights seem to float like the Mississippi River. It's your stuff and it's safe. Jotta Cloud guarantees it, and our service are powered by green energy. Jotta Cloud guarantees that as well. Be safe. So you should feel very good, I guess, if you're a Norwegian, you want to store your data locally. Personally, I would not place great reliance on this statement as a lawyer. I think it contains a number of fundamental flaws. But, you know, in terms of marketing hype, maybe some people are convinced by that kind of thing. Now, a little bit more seriously, in the last few years, there's been some discussion at intergovernment level, actually, in the European Union about the idea of building a European internet. And this goes back to before the Snowden revelations. So back in February 2011, there was a joint meeting of the Law Enforcement Working Party and the Customs Cooperation Working Party in the EU. And there's this fascinating statement in a minute of that meeting under the heading cybercrime. The presidency of the Law Enforcement Working Party presented its intention to propose concrete measures towards creating a single, secure European cyberspace with certain virtual Schengen borders and virtual access points whereby the internet service providers would block illicit contents on the basis of the EU blacklist. Now, again, plenty for people to argue about there, including specific terminology. The Schengen border, just very briefly, is an allusion to the free movement of people zone, which applies to a subset of the European Union. So some particular countries like the UK and Ireland, for example, are not in the Schengen free movement zone. But the idea was that there would be this European internet space where there would be no restrictions on the movement of data, including personal data, maybe including sensitive personal data, health data, for example. But there would be a wall, effectively, around that zone, and there would be a virtual border with virtual access points to control flows of data. Now, following the Snowden revelations, these discussions went, as I say, up to the governmental level. And in August 2013, Deutsche Telekom and United Internet AG, which I think is the largest ISP in Germany, came out with a proposal for email made in Germany. Now, what on earth does that mean? I mean, there are all kinds of issues here. Maybe if two Germans want to communicate about German stuff and it never leaves the German borders and they don't want to communicate with the rest of the world, then I suppose in theory you could build a German email system. But I don't quite see how that maps onto how people actually behave. And indeed, thanks to Thomas and his colleagues in Cambridge, I understand there are some fundamental technical problems with building a German email system or a German internet more broadly. In fact, they have this wonderful Internetz with a Z on the end concept, because if you go down below software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, no time to explain any of that, there is something underneath all of that, which is network. Some people call it network as a service, but when you get down to those pipes I showed you, the fiber optic cables, the server farms, the physical stuff, then it turns out that data moves around rather a lot. And even Germany, which has a very strong telecom provider of its own, a long-standing former monopolist, in fact, Deutsche Telekom, I understand technically is dependent on other international operators like Telefonica in Spain and British Telecom in the UK to do some of its internet routing. Quite a lot of internet traffic that's German to German actually goes through access points in other countries like the UK. Anyway, Atos resurrected, which is a very large French outsourcing service provider, resurrected this idea of a Schengen system for data. And Germany, again, October same year, Deutsche Telekom announced it had a German-only routing aim for internet traffic. And then in November the same year, really hotting up in Germany, the German Interior Minister announced a legal framework for hindering interception. So this is kind of based on the Snowden revelations, a mechanism ostensibly to provide a barrier to protect German citizens from interception, specifically by the US government. The following year, Angela Merkel and François Hollande, the leaders of Germany and France, respectively, called for building up of European communications networks, quotes, to avoid emails and other data passing through the US. Now, actually, all of that stuff was, in my view, largely hype, and I don't think it's changed dramatically what happens in practice. But there are some issues even within the EU. So the European Commission is internally divided on this question of, do we really want Balkanization of the internet? Do we really want a Europe-only cloud environment? And the parts of the Commission that are more interested in promoting free trade, both intra-EU, between the EU member states, and globally, they are very unhappy about this. And so a statement was made last September, in fact, by the Vice President Ansip speaking at the Digital Assembly in Bratislava, where he said, actually, this is fundamentally inconsistent with the way the single market's supposed to work. Germany is part of the European Union. There should be no borders, no boundaries in terms of transfers of data between Germany and the rest of the EU. And interestingly, this echoes a little bit what President Obama said the year before. The argument that this is about privacy is not true in most cases. There are other forces at work here. Now, I want to give you some examples from other parts of the world of forced localization of data. And this may actually give us some context to start to unpack why are governments doing this? Is it about privacy? Or, as we've heard a couple of arguments, maybe it's about other things. And if so, what are those other things? So I love this quote from an MP in the Russian Parliament, Russian Duma. Most Russians don't want their data to leave Russia for the United States, where it can be hacked and given to criminals. Our entire lives are stored over there. Again, echoes of those early 70s European and Canadian concerns about US processing of personal data relating to their citizens. This is much more recent. This is in Russia. Some would say this is highly ironic as a statement, but I'm sure it wasn't intended to be ironic. So anyway, this was in the context of a new law in Russia that was adopted in September 2015, which requires online service providers to establish local server facilities in Russia if they are processing data relating to Russian citizens. It came into force, in September 2015. The scope remains unclear to this day, so does it apply to Russian citizens anywhere in the world, for example, if you're outside Russia? But from my perspective, one of the most interesting features is there don't appear to be restrictions on having extra copies of data outside Russia. And if that's the case, what has this got to do with protecting Russians, say, from Americans and enhancing privacy protection for Russian citizens? If the Russian government doesn't actually care, the Russian parliament doesn't care as well, whether your Russian data ends up replicated all over the planet, maybe this isn't really anything to do with privacy. Maybe the opposite might even be the case. And more recently still, an anti-terrorism law from July last year requires telecom operators and ISPs to store metadata, which some would argue is the most critical data in terms of privacy protection, in Russia, physically on servers in Russia for 3 years, and from July next year to store all message content in Russia for 6 months. Now, I can't count this stuff, but I'm told that's an awful lot of data, and maybe they've slightly underestimated just how much capacity they would need for that kind of storage. Right. A very practical example to show that this Russian law is actually being enforced in practice. There's a timeline on the left from August 2016 to March 2017. It involves LinkedIn, which is the world's largest social network for professionals, nearly 500 million professionals on this site. Anybody here on LinkedIn? Okay, quite a few of you. I'm assuming the others are still students. When you want to get a job in future, you'll be on LinkedIn, believe me. Right, okay, so back in August last year, Tagansky District Court, which is near Moscow, ordered the Russian Data Protection Authority. Anybody here speak Russian? I'm going to try and pronounce it. Roskomnadzor is the closest I can get, to block LinkedIn in Russia. And the reason was because LinkedIn was not complying with the data localization law, and it had not got all its Russian citizen data in Russia. The Moscow City Court, which was the appeal court, upheld this decision in November last year, and the same day, the Data Protection Authority ordered telcos and ISPs to block LinkedIn throughout Russia. There were then discussions to try and modify this very strict ruling, and meetings, particularly in December, took place. But just last month, there was an announcement that talks had broken down, and apparently because LinkedIn was still refusing to move data storage to Russia. Now, those of you who use LinkedIn may actually be pleased about that. Maybe you don't care. But this is a very significant example, I would say, of the fact that this particular data localization law is being enforced in practice. And we've seen previously how you can get sort of balkanization occurring. For example, even global sites with nearly 2 billion users like Facebook. Facebook's probably the only one actually that falls into that category. But you won't find them in some countries. You will find a local competitor in some parts of Asia, for example. And indeed, moving on to China seamlessly, China also has data localization laws. These are very new. So cybersecurity law, which was adopted in November 2016, comes into force in June this year. And it requires that providers of cloud services to Chinese residents must host the personal data in China. And where data are transferred abroad, a copy of the data must be retained in China. And even more recently, 11th of April, so just a couple of weeks ago, draft measures for security assessment of outbound transmission of personal information and critical data were issued. This would expand the scope of that law that I just mentioned to cover not just personal data, but any, quotes, critical data, not very clearly defined, I understand, I don't read Chinese, but I understand it's not very clear, but it probably covers not just sort of nationally critical data like national security data, however you interpret that, but data relating to economic development and the public interest. And we may see that that becomes a very broad category indeed. And it might lead to local storage of data in China by default. Because if companies, cloud providers, for example, can't be sure whether or not they are caught by one of these laws, then history suggests that they tend to err on the side of caution. And if the market is big enough, either in terms of people or cash terms or whatever, strategically important, then they build local infrastructure. We've seen that happening a lot in Europe, and we're starting to see it also in Asia. Now, surprisingly, this particular proposal is out for public consultation. So if any of you have strong views about it, you have until the 11th of May to comment to the Chinese government. Other countries requiring data localization already, I'm not going to go through these in detail, there isn't time, just going to list them actually. Very interesting list. Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Turkey, and Vietnam. Now, why that particular list? Is this because these are the countries that lead in terms of human rights and privacy protection? Or maybe is something else going on here? And from a very practical point of view, coming down to the level of internet flow control, I'll throw that in again for Thomas, does it make sense? I mean, I don't know if you can read this from the back, but here's a couple of border guards saying, oh, look, more data crossing our border again. I mean, come on, get real. That isn't quite how it works. So I wonder if we should be asking some very different questions here. Why is it that governments, legislators, regulators are so obsessed with the physical location of data? Maybe it isn't just data protection. Perhaps it's because it's convenient for them to enforce other laws, such as it's relatively easy to tax people if they have infrastructure in your country, if they are incorporated with a subsidiary in your country, if they have people in your country. It may be to enforce completely unrelated laws, such as laws regulating gambling, which are quasi-monopolies in many parts of the world, including the United States. And indeed, there is a real internet case about gambling involving the United States, where a guy who was running a company in the UK, which was perfectly lawfully providing online gaming services, came to the US on holiday with his family, was arrested at the airport and thrown in jail because it was illegal here. And gambling, I understand, is something that you put into particular pockets like Las Vegas and places like that. But the idea there should be a free market and competition in things like gambling services hasn't quite taken off here yet. Data protection is on the list of reasons why governments at least say they are forcing localization. But we'll come back to that in a moment. It could be, to be cynical now, and I gave you a list of countries, and I gave you the examples from Russia and China, it may actually be that the real driver for governments is to do with surveillance in two directions. First of all, they may want to feel at least they can restrict foreign surveillance more than they can if their cloud infrastructure providers, for example, are outside their country. But even more cynically, it may be to facilitate local surveillance. They may think it's easier for them to get a hold of citizen data, maybe data from political dissidents, etc., if the data are stored physically in their country. And again, to be cynical, there may be a strong protectionist theme, at least in some of these countries, where the reason they want to insist on usage of local infrastructure is to promote local or regional service providers. And I personally think there's an element of that in the German arguments I was presenting earlier and the French arguments, where major companies in Germany and France were lobbying hard and getting the ear of their governments to force a higher level of localization for their citizens' data. But even more fundamental question, which is something I would love to discuss with you, many of whom know a lot more about the technical side than I do, my understanding is that we may be looking at entirely the wrong thing here. So physical access to, say, a server with data on it is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for access to intelligible information. So, for example, it might be that German citizen data is stored on a server in Germany operated by a German company, but if it's not stored securely and they don't have appropriate access controls, then that will neither secure the data, nor will it prevent other people from outside the country accessing that data. So conversely, logical access controls, or rather logical access is both necessary and sufficient to get access to intelligible information. Now, I hope that I've explained that clearly enough, but I think the idea that where the data is physically residing, if I can use that word, on a server, maybe they're looking in the wrong place. And we should look at who has the ability to access the data logically, regardless of where they happen to be in geographical terms. Now, there's a very interesting experiment on this, which goes counter to all the examples I've given so far, which is, that cartoon is courtesy of The Economist, by the way. That is a little country called Estonia, which is very much in the news because it's, many people say, the most wired, the most high-tech country on the planet. They had to rebuild everything, their entire government and all the infrastructure in the early 1990s when they became independent from Russia, and they decided to start again. So they have an electronic identification system from birth. Almost all transactions with government agencies are done online, can only be done online. Anyway, there's a whole lot more to say about that. But one of their concerns remains that they could lose control over their physical territory, again, as they have done in the past. So they came up with a rather interesting model, which they call the virtual data embassy solution. And they did a pilot project, actually, in response, cryptically they call it, to geopolitical events in 2014. Anybody think what that might have been? Ukraine, thank you. Yes. So they looked at what was happening in Ukraine, and they became increasingly concerned that it could happen again to them. So they wanted to come up with a way of ensuring a digital continuity plan for essential public services, so that even if Estonia were to be overrun again by foreign forces and they were to lose control of their territory, could they still keep the country as a virtual thing alive somehow outside that territorial space? There's two key elements to this plan. First one is, very clever actually from a lawyer's point of view, you put server racks in Estonian embassies in friendly foreign countries so that actually they remain part of Estonia. They're treated as Estonian soil. Estonian law applies in those embassy buildings. Very clever way of keeping the data Estonian and alive, even if Estonia doesn't exist physically anymore. But secondly, they, as a backup plan, started to experiment with virtual embassies for data in privately owned public clouds. Now, that is a very tricky concept. I'm not entirely sure I see the argument, but the idea was using strong encryption access controls, they wanted to be able to have copies of citizen data, not just in embassies, but also in a public cloud where they would get far greater resiliency, in terms of the broader perspective on security, availability of data, etc., not just keeping it under their sovereignty. And I use that word in quotes because that's a loaded term as well. So they found, having run this pilot, that there were no fundamental legal or technical obstacles to scaling it up. And this suggests that a radical alternative to all of those examples I gave you earlier of forced localization and export controls on personal data is to do the opposite. Deliberately move your data offshore, but put it somewhere where you retain control and where you are confident that there's a high level of security that will deliver confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, another possibility, this is not entirely science fiction, there are some ships being built, is Google's patent for a water-based data center. This is obviously a hugely simplified picture, but it's from the patent specification. So here you have your container ship, which would have many more than 4 containers. It would have hundreds or thousands of containers, each of which would contain effectively a server farm in a box. And those containerized cloud servers farms are already being deployed on land, and they could easily be deployed at sea. Well, I say easily, there is a snag I'll get to in a minute. this is a really nice feature. You get free electricity. So you have these pontoons floating out the back of your container ship, and as they move up and down in the ocean, they have hydraulic rams pictured here, and they generate free electricity for you. But the flaw, at least I think, potential weakness of this plan is how do you get really high bandwidth connectivity to these ships in both directions? And I have asked people about this, and I haven't been given an entirely convincing answer yet. Now, of course, for some purposes, you might be able to use satellite communications, but I understand that's a lot better for down than up. Is that right? Put very simply. There must be some network people here. Are there limitations on bandwidth for satellite communications?
So the bandwidth isn't the problem with satellite, it's latency.
Latency, thank you very much. Yeah, satellite's too far away. Okay, latency, right. So ideally, you would have chunky fiber optic cables coming to your ship, but that looks like a point of weakness if you're trying to remain out of control, out of the jurisdiction of the nearest country. Of course, the answer might be, well, if somebody tries to interfere with your fiber optic cable, you pull up the anchors and you sail off the next friendly jurisdiction, or you stay in international waters, but then you've got connectivity problems again. So anyway, just when we thought we'd identified, and I've been working on this for 35 years, all the technical, commercial, legal risks involved in procuring computing services, we have to consider law of the sea, maritime law, never studied that, and the danger you might meet real pirates. I'm not talking software pirates here, I'm talking about people with AK-47s who try to board your cloud server farm afloat. Anyway, so I'm not sure we're going to see that imminently, although there are rumors that 2 of these ships are currently at a fairly advanced stage of construction at the moment. Now, if you want to explore this topic anymore, we can have a discussion, which I would love to do with you. And there's also some papers out there. This is a paper that was co-authored by the teams that Thomas referred to from the Computer Lab at the University of Cambridge, the other Cambridge, and the team I work with at Queen Mary University of London. And a shorter policy piece, this is published by the IEEE, which sets out some of the themes I've just summarized today, is available, I think, free online via the IEEE. And I'm nearly finished. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to know more about the Cloud Legal Project, Microsoft Cloud Computing Research Center, there are links there. And shameless bit of promotion, you can buy this book online right now. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments?
So
It'd be helpful to me, by the way, if you could say who you are so I know where you're coming from.
Sure. So I'm Seth Proctor. I have no affiliation with Harvard. Margot, I told you about this talk. This was really interesting. Thank you for
coming.
For sharing. I guess I'm curious about many things, but one question I'll ask. You talked about all the various plausible possible reasons that those countries on your list would have for wanting to control outbound or inbound information, wanting to control information on behalf of their citizens. As you said, sovereign is a loaded word. I guess I'm just wondering, have you looked at what you're doing in the context of spaces like the energy industry, where there's kind of 40 years of examples of people using the word sovereign in terms of data, and then very specifically using it to quantify the value of data so they can talk about not just control of information, but also very clearly kind of show the economics of why you allow data to leave and come back and what that means, and have you tried to apply it back to these ideas?
No, that's a really good question. I mean, the economic analysis of data flows is not something I have seen people really digging into. But there's a fundamental reason for that, perhaps. In the EU and a number of the other countries on that list of 120 that have these data protection laws, this is not really an economic argument. It's a human rights argument. So in the European Union, in our Charter of Fundamental Rights, data protection is listed as a fundamental human right. I mean, it's not listed in your constitution because that was perhaps written a little earlier, but although people managed to interpret it in extraordinary ways from a foreign perspective. So data protection, control over your own personal data is regarded as a fundamental human right in the UK. And that is somewhat at tension with the idea that this is about monetizing data, it's about the economics, it's about the pros and cons financially of doing stuff locally and offshore and in both directions. Although those arguments do come up, I see them occasionally, particularly in the US. It's quite a hard sell to countries where data protection is regarded as a fundamental human right.
It's a very noble answer.
Other questions? Yes.
So I'm the Guilty, Margo. So maybe this is a stupid question, but, so I love the Estonian solution in the virtual data centers. This seems brilliant. But there's an interesting question about key management, because all this data is encrypted, and in the presence of a geopolitical event, you could imagine that any humans who actually knew the keys would perhaps be made rendered inaccessible. So
no, that's a very good question. I hadn't thought about it specifically. I imagine that you might entrust, say, your ambassador in Washington or London or wherever with some access rights, so that even if the government, in terms of the people, was wiped out locally, you would still have this remote possibility for living on as a country. That's a good question. I mean, and that is, of course, a huge issue, I understand, in data security generally. It's the human factors, a massive problem.
You could imagine those taking such geopolitical action being somewhat clueful and doing not just a local event, but a global event. And I don't know, it's actually a really interesting question. I love this idea of putting it on the cloud. That's brilliant. But there is the age-old problem of key management.
Well, it might be that, to be pragmatic, the Estonian government, although it is a tech leader, it's 1.5 million people or something like that. It's, you know, in economic terms, pretty small. I would be surprised if somebody would risk starting World War III over trying to bomb all the Estonian embassies around the world.
Oh, you wouldn't have to bomb them.
Well, cyber attacks, even taking them down, given the collateral damage that might occur, is quite a risky strategy, I would have thought. But that's probably, well, it's beyond my pay grade. It's probably beyond our discussion today. Other comments or questions would be welcome. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm from the University of Warwick in the UK. I'm just here for a quick stint. Yeah, so my question was, so what are the implications of like these localization laws, for instance, for small e-commerce business?
Yeah.
So if I'm an e-commerce business in the UK and I have customers all over the world, am I actually going to need to put in a server in Saudi Arabia, China, and Russia if I only have a couple of customers there?
Very good question. And the maps I showed earlier on, you know, for example, showing the Amazon, the AWS footprint globally, where they are building large data centers all over the planet. It's all very well for Amazon and Microsoft and Google and IBM and others to do that. Although even for a company as big as IBM, that's a pretty big challenge, actually. They don't have the scale at the moment that, say, Amazon has. But you're quite right. If you're a small e-commerce service provider in any country outside that list that has localization rules, it may just destroy your opportunity to sell into that country because you can't afford to have local infrastructure. However, this is where virtualization and so on might come to the rescue. If you could, in some of those countries, persuade a regulator that you don't need to have physical servers in that country, you just need to use physical servers operated by, say, an infrastructure as a service provider, or even a PaaS provider, and you run your own secure SaaS operations on those servers. Well, your data will still be in that country, arguably, but you don't have to build a data center. Now, that's an open question, I would say, for most of those countries. We don't know whether you can comply virtually and not just physically with those laws. It's a good question, though. Other comments or questions? Yes?
Hi, I'm Diane Williams. I'm an entrepreneur, computer scientist, alum of MIT and Harvard.
Excellent.
First of all, as an American citizen, I'm very envious of the Canadians and the Europeans for having control after going to the Berkman events and saying, oh, the ISP is going to sell your browser history. Yeah. It's like, when does it stop? You know, like you can make an amazing dollar honorably, and the level of contempt that a lot of these companies have for citizens, and you know, coming from the tech field, it's appalling. Do you think, first of all, I would say another comment is like, please hold on, do not let any European lobbies try to make you lower yourself to the US standard. Please, don't do it. Don't, whatever. Okay, that's just, now I got that out of my stuff. Okay. I'm very, you know, like we were talking about the issues of privacy.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly that's not going to go away. Cybercrime is not going to go away. I think it's going to increase even more so. How can I say this? if the U.S. is not on the same page with so many countries, when you're talking about whether it's a national, international rule of running businesses or e-commerce or anything like that, how can this be moved forward? I mean, will the U.S. be forced to change its rules to come up to the level of the UU, or is this a rhetorical question?
No, it's a great question.
Because it's really, because I mean, Google's not going away, at least tomorrow.
Right.
These companies, Microsoft, they're not going away. They are it used to be the GEs, or it's the Apple.
Absolutely.
Googles, you know what I mean? They're the big 800-pound gorillas.
So let me try to answer that.
Yes, I really.
It's a great question, and I think we will see different things happening. But first comment is that Europeans love American cloud services, believe me. And if regulators or governments were to say, we really are going to switch off Facebook and Google and all these other services, there would be probably a revolution. So I don't know pragmatically that it makes a lot of sense. However, having said that, these really big players, the type you've listed, are responding very fast, actually, in terms of localization. So we see Amazon and Microsoft and IBM and Google building hyperscale data centers in Europe. And they may present that, the justification for that has been they want to be closer to their customers, they want to reduce latency, but actually I suspect that these factors we've been discussing are significant drivers in that. Similarly, going back to that Google Spain right to be forgotten case I mentioned, and talking briefly about the actual substance of that case that most people are interested in, within a couple of weeks, Google had put up not exactly a takedown process, but a process whereby you or anybody on the planet can fill in a form, goes to Google, and you say, I want you to stop listing these search results when somebody searches for my name. And many people have put in these requests, and many of them have been successful. So there you see a very rapid response where maybe that's just not the battle that company wants to fight to the death on, and they will accommodate these local law requirements to do things differently. And that was explicitly based on European data protection laws. So yeah, you're right, pragmatically, the world's leading cloud companies are almost all American, and increasingly most of their customers are outside the US, and they really want to keep those services as customers. But I think they're also showing quite a lot of pragmatism in terms of the way they respond to foreign requests to comply with local data protection laws, to do localization and so on. But they don't all. So LinkedIn, as you saw, didn't cave in Russia. Another example I didn't have time to talk about involves Turkey, where PayPal shut down last year in Turkey. And there were rumors they were going to reopen in March this year, but they've squashed those rumors. So for the time being, because they refuse to localize all the financial transaction data relating to Turkish citizens in Turkey, they're not going to operate in Turkey. So that is another response. Yes?
Hey, I'm Ben. I'm in undergrad in applied math at SEAS. And I think one question I had was, it seems like we just talked about how most of the big cloud companies are based in America. And I think in part, one of the reasons why, maybe you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like one of the reasons why the US hasn't imposed necessarily data localization standards is in part because these companies have already made it big and they're looking to expand abroad across international borders. And it seems that a lot of regulators in these other countries, like Norway, for instance, or Russia, are being persuaded by lobbyists from domestic cloud companies to basically shut down these international ventures so that they can establish local maybe cloud services for their own domestic businesses. But it seems that a lot of these are kind of maybe budding cloud companies that are just getting started. Do you envision that over time, as these, assuming all this data localization works and these companies get bigger, do you envision these lobbyists maybe changing their attitude and saying maybe we should get rid of these localization restrictions for such and such purpose, but really we just want to expand abroad and expand our business to compete with these other companies like Google or Apple?
No, that's a very, very good perspective, actually. And it's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future, even though things move fast in this space. I suspect for a while we will see, in economic terms, the US cloud providers having this very strong position in the global market. But you're right, if there was some, not killer app, but killer service that everybody on the planet, including Americans, wanted, and it happened to be outside the US, then yes, that kind of issue might arise. So if Facebook with 1.9 or 2 billion users happened to be in Europe, then maybe social network providers for the mass market in the US might want to have a bit more protectionism. You're right, it could. As a thought experiment, it works. I'm not sure we're going to see it soon, but it's a good point. Yeah.
Dan, I'm an alum of the college. So on the way over here, I heard a new author speaking about open versus closed was the topic on NPR, strangely enough. And the analogy they were using was chessboard versus the web. And that got me thinking about the cathedral and the bazaar. So there's all these metaphors we used to use, right? So this seems like something like individual sovereignty versus, or there's some new metaphor that this speaks to that I'm not quite sure of, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And what I'm intuiting is something about individual sovereignty versus something else. Individual's relationship to the data, and then all of these old notions of nation